We welcome you to this 7th Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture. The Raza Foundation organizes every year 8 memorial lectures for Kumar Gandhar, for Habib Tanveer, V.S. Gaitonde, Kelucharan Mahapatra, Daya Krishna, Agge, Charles Korea, and Mani Kaur. This lecture the idea is to create a body of critical thinking around the various areas. In case of Dr. Daya Krishna, he was one of the most outstanding philosophers we had in post-independent India. And he had a very interesting career. He started as an expert on Western philosophy. In fact, when I was a student in Saga University, he had just joined as a young lecturer. But what distinguished him from others was that he was also deeply interested in literature, in contemporary literature. And we were, some of us young ones, trying to raise the banner of the new, much to the dislike of the orthodox Hindi departments and such like. And one of the persons who encouraged us to do this was Daya Krishna. Later, of course, he shifted to Jaipur and he became Pro-Vice Chancellor. But later in his philosophical career, he moved from that to the Indian philosophy and started raising questions about many of the things which are assumed to be taken as accepted. He also, interestingly, discovered that there were some women and some tribal sages in the Vedas, that they have written the hymns. He had rearranged the Rig Veda in a manner, and it was difficult to get a publisher. I don't know whether it has been published now, because the more important agencies who could have published it felt that this might become a sacrilegious act. How can you reorganize Rig Veda? But I mean, Daya Krishna could dare do it, and it done it. It is just to be sort of waiting for the light of the day to see it. This lecture series, this is the 7th one. The 6 lectures have been given by Ashish Nandi, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Ananya Vajpayee. I can't read something. Ramchandra Guha, Ramin Jahan Begelu, Shiva Vishwanathan. And this one is to be delivered today by RAJEEV. Now, apart from the fact that I have the good fortune of being his friend, although we don't meet all that frequently, but we have been knowing each other for a long time. Now, RAJEEV Bhargava has a very impressive academic career. He had been a professor of political theory in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and has been heading the center CSDS, has been an honorary fellow in Balliol College, Oxford, has, apart from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he has been a fellow or a visiting faculty in Harvard University, University of Bristol, the Institute of Advanced Study, Jerusalem, Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna, the British Academy, Stanford, Asia Chair at Paris, etc. His published works include Individualism in Social Science, Multiculturalism, Liberalism and Democracy, Politics and Ethics of the Indian Constitution, What is Political Theory, Why do we need it, The Promise of India's Secular Democracy, Secular States and Religious Diversity. I find he is an OUP writer also, which is also, so many books have been published by OUP, which itself must be a matter of some distinction. So he is going to talk about, can we afford not to be secular? Before I invite him, may I present him with a bouquet of flowers?
And so many distinguished friends. I'm quite overwhelmed that I find that there are a whole lot of people who I've learned a lot from. So I thank you very much for coming here. Of course, I'm grateful to Raza Foundation for inviting me to give this very prestigious lecture. Daya Bhai was a much admired senior colleague. I first met him in the early 80s in Jaipur, but he began to take notice of me only after I published my first book as an Oxford philosophical monograph, Individualism in Social Science. And after that, he invited me to write for the ICPR journal, which he edited with so much dedication. He sent me articles for refereeing and books to review, and together we discovered many plagiarists, some very renowned figures. And these interactions made us friends. He was an immensely original and creative thinker, very dynamic, very energetic, a major figure of his generation in philosophy. But also, as I said, somebody who could have fun with, a charming friend. And so it's a real honor for me to give this lecture in his memory. Now, the title of my talk today, as you know, is Can We Afford Not to Be Secular? The structure and propositional content of this statement resembles statements like, can we afford not to have clean air? Can we afford not to have clean water? We know that we won't die immediately without clean water or air, but over a period of time it will be difficult for us to survive. So the consequences of living without them for human life is very bad, indeed disastrous. Likewise, a very similar kind of question would be, can we afford not to live without good music or poetry? And again, we might be, we might barely survive as a society without them, but I don't think we'd survive as a good society. These good poetry, good music is an integral part of the good life, and no decent and civilized society can do without it. So I propose that practice of secularism, and of course the cluster of thoughts behind it, are an integral part of a crucial dimension of a good collective life of society. Without secularism we might survive, but we'd be much worse off. We will be a pretty horrid society. So really, we can't afford not to be secular, in the same sense in which we can't afford not to have clean water and so on. Now, this answer of mine is along expected lines. It won't surprise at least those people sitting over here who have known my work. So the key question, this is a very simple question for me to answer, but the key question then is a conceptual one. And this is so because secular and secularism have many senses. There are multiple meanings. Secularism comes in many forms. And therefore we need to ask, in what sense or senses is it an important dimension of a good life, so crucial that we can't afford to lose it? Moreover, if the plural personal pronoun we refers to Indians, all of us, every single Indian, then the question is even more specific. In what sense or senses is it an important dimension of the good collective life of Indian citizens? Which secularism is well suited for us, such that, us meaning Indians, such that we can't afford to lose it? In what sense of secular, following which secularism, can Indians Indians not survive, or Indian society will not survive in a good society? So really, it's a question of identifying which defensible secularism there is, and for us, and that's what I'm going to try and do here. Basically, I'm going to divide this lecture into three parts. In the first part, I would argue that secularism is necessarily anti-religion. I've sort of revised my views on this several times, and I will explain what I mean by that. I would say further in the second part of my talk that Indian secularism, in particular, not only has that anti-religion bent, but it's also, and this probably is the core of Indian secularism, it's supposed to institutionalize religious domination, and I'll explain obviously what I mean by that. And since I can't help, and we must be self-critical, I can't help being self-critical, I will at the end say a few words about where we might have gone wrong as those who claim to be secularists, and where they may have gone wrong. But that's basically the structure of my talk. So let me begin with the first part. So as I said, built into secularism is a certain degree of opposition to religion. And as I said, I've revisited this whole issue a number of times. I've gone over it, kept changing my views. And I would say that what I mean by this is that secularism, Indian secularism, is not anti-religious, but has problems with religion. So I'm making a distinction here between being anti-religion and being anti-religious. So to explain fully will take me a lot of time. I've been spending quite a lot of time trying to figure all this out. And if I were to give a good answer to this question, I would take the entire lecture. So I'll possibly take about 10-15 minutes to explain what I mean by that. So what's the distinction that I'm making between anti-religious and anti-religion? The category of religion orders our religious and ethical experience in particular ways, and then elicits certain normative responses that we begin to call secular. And to explain this point, I'd like to elaborate this point by introducing a term of art. It's very simple. I'd call it ethics of self-fulfillment. All human beings have the capacity to realize that a gap exists between our current situation, what we currently are able to do or to be, and what in future, at our best, we can do or be. And where can we can reach with improvement. And for this we need a vision of the good life, what it is that is worth having or being, sometimes even what is it that is of ultimate worth. And we need a map of how to get there, usually with the help of others, actually always with the help of others. It's a social project, right? So there's always a community there. But also sometimes, well, not sometimes, quite a lot, with the help of people we look up to. It's this vision and this map that I'm calling an ethics of self-fulfillment. Sometimes it can also be a salvific ethic. There are a lot of people who are obsessed with what's going to happen to them after death. And then this ethic of self-fulfillment can become an ethic for salvation, right? And all of this can be done through worship, through rituals, through meditation, and through a lot of reflection, including philosophical reflection. Now we also, so that's what I mean by an ethic of self-fulfillment. We also know that there always exist multiple paths of self-realization, a plurality of ethics of self-fulfillment. And therefore there are multiple ethical communities within which you strive for self-realization or self-fulfillment. And moreover, some of these ethics are gods and goddesses dependent. Some are dependent on one almighty God, and some are entirely independent of God, gods, and goddesses. That's the plurality of ethics. Even more importantly, and this is a point that I really want to insist on, that you note carefully, even more importantly, this plurality of ethics may exist within a broader social imaginary, within a large framework, which enables translatability of categories across these ethics. Or there can be frameworks that disenable this translation. They don't allow for translation to take place. Now, most of our ancient cultures, in many of them, if you're looking at pre-Islamic Arabia or Greece and Rome and certainly in India, you find that gods of one culture have been related to gods of another culture. And this can happen by many strategies. One is a strategy of equivalence. So for example, the god of rain in one culture is the same as the god of rain in another culture. So you come up and you say that it's the same god, it's just got different names. Sometimes the strategies of collocation of gods and goddesses. So for example, in Egypt you had Amun-Re, and we have in the south, in the Indian subcontinent, you have something like Harihar. Now here gods do not entirely merge. They retain their individuality, but each becomes a crucial aspect of the other. As Hari becomes the cosmic aspect of Har, and Har the local cultic aspect of Hari. Each complements the other without subsumption or domination. And finally, there's a third strategy of benign ontological subordination. So you have one God who is supreme, who is the supreme deity, and the other becomes his manifestation, so, or incarnation. So you have Ram and Krishna as incarnation of Vishnu, or you have Ganesh in other ways of relating, where Ganesh becomes the son of Shiva and Parvati, and so on. And as I was saying, that this translation needn't be just across ethics, which are dependent on gods and goddesses, but it can also be across ethics which do not depend upon gods and goddesses, but on one God. I mean, you remember Gandhi, much later, who talked about Allah and Ishwar being the same. And it can also happen across ethics without any God. You can find this translation. And one example, of course, is how some of the Puranic and Vedic deities were incorporated within Buddhism as somewhat subordinate in a very benign sort of way. So the thing about this social imaginary or this culture which allows for translatability is that there is easy movement here. There's a possibility of moving from one to the other, and there's also a possibility of multiple attachments. Now, in direct contrast to such cultures, and I want to insist that these are cultures which are not, these are cultures that are been there in virtually every part of the world. I wouldn't call them very specific to India. Maybe India. In India, they've lasted longer, there's more, but they existed everywhere. Certainly in large parts of South Asia, but also in every culture that I know of. But in direct contrast to such cultures, there have been at very specific points of time some other cultures which developed, which have had strategies to block such translation. So you get something like an exclusionary monotheism that announces that there is only one true God and all other gods are false. And even when they're recognized to exist, even when they're recognized to be real, one is expressly forbidden to worship them. And once you have this kind of an idea, then you have no place for gods and goddesses, normatively speaking, and no place, normatively speaking, for the belief in the non-existence of God. And so the tendency here is to deny the normative value of plurality. Now, I wish to argue that this exclusionary quality, this very emphatic conception of truth, is one crucial feature of what we call religion. One true ethic. And you can see that I'm using this term in a very broad way to include all those philosophies that also insist on one truth. There can be scientism, which is like that. We had logical positivism in the early 1920s, in the early 20th century, which insisted on there being not only one kind of standard of truth, but also one standard of meaningfulness. I think a certain version of, and certainly Stalinism also had this tendency to talk about one truth. And I would argue, well, not here, but certain kinds of nationalisms also have that quality about one, this is the, nothing else. Anyhow, but this is one very important feature of what is religion, and I think I'm not doing violence to the idea of the development of religion, because a lot of scholars of religion have actually argued that religion is a category that developed at a certain point of time in the history of some traditions, and it's not something which is found everywhere. Okay, let me get to the second distinction, second feature. And here I introduce a distinction between an ethics of fulfillment, which I mentioned, and norms of social interaction. By norms of social interaction, again, I mean something very elementary. All those rules and rituals of everyday conduct, with whom one should interact, who and who not must one marry, who and who not can one dine with, what kind of job is suitable to who given his social position or ranking. So usually status hierarchies. So this is certainly a lot of our societies had these social hierarchies built into these norms of social interaction. But of course, that needn't be the case, and we know that a lot of societies today have moved beyond that. But nonetheless, the issue of equality or hierarchy is not what I'm interested in. I'm only talking about norms of social interaction being distinct from an ethic of self-fulfillment. Now, it's the connection between the two which is very important. Is the connection between ethics of self-fulfillment and norms of social interaction, is it very loose or is it tight? And in fact, it's so tight that it becomes one single comprehensive system. So that you cannot have one ethic and follow a completely different set of social norms or switch between different social norms. There's that sort of thing. This ethic, you have to follow certain rituals and you have to you have to comply with a particular set of social norms. And I think this would be, for me, a second feature of religion, that it insists on a very tight connection between ethic of self-fulfillment and norms of social interaction. And not only that, that it has a very powerful institutionalized structure by which to impose social sanctions against those who deviate either from the ethic or from the norms. So now we can talk about two contrasting cultures. One is a culture of religion, and religions, and the other is a culture of what, since I'm using the category of religion, I would just call it non-religion. I don't have any other name for it. It's a culture of non-religions. It's like non-governmental organizations. Sorry, I mean, which means that in the following sense that they're other than governmental organizations, so they're other than religion. But because we have this category of the government, they are defined in relation to that, and that's their first kind of that's their first definition, non-government. So that's my first definition, non-religion. What exactly they are is something that we can figure out, but these are non-religions. They resemble religion in some ways. I mean, they have, but they are not religion. And there is a third feature. So that's a second feature, tight connection. There's a third feature, which develops, these two features that I've been talking about also develop in Latin Christendom. But the third feature is really the defining feature of Latin Christendom, and it develops in the 16th, 17th century, in 16th and 17th century Europe. And in fact, there are a lot of scholars, I'm reminded of some great scholar who I've learned a lot from, Wilfred Campbell Smith. Some of the older people here might remember him. He taught at the Aligarh Muslim University. He was in Lahore for some time. He was an enormously erudite person. He's forgotten a bit now, but he was very fond of insisting that this whole category of religion really developed in 16th, 17th century Europe. And by this, he meant the following, that with the breakdown of Latin Christendom, wars of religion erupted everywhere, and one treaty that went some way towards stopping this was signed in Augsburg in 1555. And the famous catchphrase of this treaty was, I hope I pronounce it correctly, it's Latin, "Jus regio, ius religio," which summarizes the central claim of the treaty, that he whose territory it was has the right to enforce his faith or his religion on his subjects. So, as you might remember, the whole of Europe was divided. The northern Europe was all Protestant, with either Lutheran or Calvinist. Each territory was, and the whole south was Catholic. And there was a middle belt, which was biconfessional. It was very tiny, which included Belgium, Switzerland, what came to be later called Germany, and so on. But really, it was each territory had was divided up into different religious communities, and all these rulers they began to publicly release a document, the Confession of Faith, each propounding a rival truth, and then to enforce religious uniformity on their subjects. And if subjects dissented, they had a right to emigrate, and in fact, many of them were expelled. That's how religious homogenization was created, because the only alternative to this was death, particularly as dissent and sedition began to coincide. You can see the resonance of this, where we are also getting there. And so differences were suppressed within territories, and I'm now quoting from Ben Kaplan. Differences were suppressed within territories, validated between them, and they were made to follow existing political lines. So this confessionalization of religion is the third feature that is added to religion. And so we were witness to the birth of confessional states with a strong political alliance with a particular confessional religion, in fact, a particular church. So religion itself is seen as not just a particular religion. Religion itself is seen as mutually exclusive ethics, each claiming to be true, seeking exclusive allegiance, not only to their version of their faith, but also to the state with which they had a strong alliance. Now, Western secularism emerged in these religiously homogenized societies. And one can understand why, right? I mean, these are predominantly single religion societies, but that point apart. They emerged in this because a lot of people got very sick of this this ethical monism of the Christian doctrine. That exclusionary ethic was something that they were absolutely fed up of. Not only that, there were n number of unchurching struggles that began to take place. And finally, there were movements for deconfessionalization, church-state separation, which is what people understand in the West political secularism to be. It's just church-state separation for the sake of various things, among which are certain values like individual liberty or equality of citizenship and so on. So you can see that this Western secularism has arisen within a culture of religion. And religion here is just one religion, it's Christianity. Now what about India? where I would argue that there was a culture of non-religions for a very long time. In this culture, that theological condition that you must have only one version of the truth, that theological condition was not met. The social condition that there has to be a very strong institutionalized church which must impose very heavy sanctions in case you deviated from the ethic or from norms of social interaction, that wasn't there. And there were not such a strong alliance between the state and any particular non-religion. Now, this is a bit of a simple story, as there are very good historians sitting here and argue that this is a kind of a rosy picture, and I would agree that this narrative can be challenged. India too had a culture where religion almost, in the sense in which I'm talking about, is developed. There is the Dharam Shastric Vedic Brahmanism, which certainly began with the Manav Dharam Shastra, which was there, which not only wanted to have one particular kind of ethic, but also impose these social norms linked very tightly to it. They wanted to impose, but while they tried to impose the social norms, they didn't make an effort. And that's where they didn't impose this ethic on others. This was an ethic for themselves. For the Brahmins in particular, it wasn't an ethic of self-fulfillment that was available to others. So in that sense, that strong connection for a whole society, that couldn't be possible. There were other movements which tried to feed into this whole building of a category of religion, I would say. I'm not a historian, but I've just picked up a few things here and there. The Naqshbandi order that came from Afghanistan, where people like Sirhandi, they brought with them a certain view of Islam, which is very close to what we understand as religion. I think Guru Gobind Singh did a few things which reminds me of unlike Guru Nanak, who's a completely different figure. And of course, under the influence of the Baptists, most of the modern Hindu social reformers of the 19th century, they were thriving on this category of religion. I think their role in the formation of religion and therefore capturing this idea of encompassing religious experience into religion has to be immense. After all, Hinduism as a religion, in the way in which we understand it, is something that was created largely at that time, as distinct from, say, the non-religion of the Hindus. Okay, so, but I still think that although elements of what we call religion were present and they did emerge from time to time, and individual sort of elements did become very strong, they did not, to my mind, although I'm not a historian, this is a hypothesis, as a theoretician, and I'm sort of throwing, they didn't coalesce at the same time to become what we call religion until very late. And this process of what I call religionization didn't really fully take hold until the 19th century. And it's still pretty much an unfinished project in India. So, non-religion and religion coexist side by side. And today, of course, we use the category of religion for both. We include both of them. Religion and non-religion are both. And we have a Sanskrit term for it, dharma, which is actually a term that we use for religion, and a religion which includes what I call religion and non-religion. Okay, so now, secularism is anti-religion in this sense of religion, and it must contain, must retain this constitutive sense of not allowing the development of religion. The West fought religion. And that's why they had this secularism. In India, there have been very often attempts at, when attempts were made to religionize, they were checked. And there has been a plurality of ethics, what we call religious pluralism, religious diversity in practice and belief. It's very hard to find that attempts to actually, successful attempts to ensure that there is a strong connection between ethics of fulfillment and norms of social interaction, which can be sustained over a certain period of time. So it's always been very loose. And as a matter of fact, we know that it's paradoxical. We know that the norms of social interaction, namely the hierarchical caste structure, is being fixed, and as long as you remain part of the structure, you can easily move from one ethic to another. You can be a Brahmin, but also be a Buddhist. As we know, a lot of the Nagarjuna was a Brahmin by birth, but he became a Buddhist. You know that and this is just much later, Muslims who have a certain caste, and also multiple attachments, multiple allegiances, people being both Hindu and Muslim, and so on, and no alliance between state and religions. I would say that Indian secularism has to oppose religion in this sense. It has to undercut religionization, and it has resources available within it, because it doesn't have to start from scratch like the West did, where they were dominated by religion, and then they had to fight the whole goddamn thing. I think there's a lot of groundwork which is already prepared for not allowing the formulation of religion, and therefore the weapons to fight it are also available. And the biggest challenge that we have, of course, is to keep this pluralism, religious pluralism, and to disconnect it from our hierarchical social order with which it was always connected, and create an egalitarian social order, which is, of course, the basic, which is what the Constitution is trying to do. And which is why because of this ambivalence in religion, because it has this other non-religion and religion both, we have constant debates in India, particularly in the Supreme Court, what is essential to religion and what is not essential. Actually, this is a debate about non-religion and religion, say. Okay, right. How much time have I taken already? Half an hour?
In 15 minutes.
No, I mean, I've taken half an hour.
Yeah, you have.
Let me just check myself. Oh. Yes, 35 minutes. Okay, so now let me come to this is one feature of Indian secularism. What is the second feature? I said that political secularism in India is opposed to institutionalized religious domination. Let me begin with some examples to explain what I mean by that. I said it's not anti-religious, but against institutionalized religious domination. So here are these examples. Here are some examples. A woman is forced to wear a burqa by her husband. A man is stoned to death for heresy. A woman is not allowed to enter a temple between the ages of 15 and 55 because she's supposed to be menstruating and is therefore polluted. A man who is believed to be an untouchable is not allowed to take water from a village well, can't ride a horse, can't wear a moustache, and he's very heavily penalized if he were to do that. Now this is, again, what is common to all these examples is that presumably members of one religious community are facing all these nasty things: humiliation, degradation, exclusion, marginalization, which I'm using a term of art here, domination. They're facing domination from members of their own religion, right? So this is intra-religious domination. This is one form of institutionalized religious domination. There is another form of this domination. Say, Ahmadiyas are deemed not to be Muslims, and their places of worship can't be called mosques. Or Shia mosques are vandalized, even burned, and demolished by Sunni extremists. This is also intra-religious domination, right? But let's take now another set of examples. A tax is imposed on Hindus but are not on Muslims by a Muslim ruler. Churches are attacked by militant Muslims, for example, in Egypt. Muslims are lynched by Hindu extremists. A person called Zafar is unable to secure a house on rent in a place such as Delhi. What's common to these examples? What is common to the examples is that members of one religious community are doing all these nasty things that I've mentioned to members of another religious community. And that's, of course, inter-religious domination. So there are these religion-related dominations which take these two forms. And I believe that political secularism is, while it protects non-religion and therefore that wide variety of religion and philosophical experiences, it has to promote and this diversity, it has to take a stand against, it has to fight both these forms of institutionalized domination. And this cannot be done by states which are religion-centered, which are either fused with religion or which have a strong alliance with religion. There has to be some separation. And that's where political secularism comes in. It must oppose these. So, protection of religious experience, religious pluralism, not being anti-religious, but checking religionization, opposing institutionalized religious domination, and so on. This is what it has to embody, in a sense, is an attitude not of total respect for religion. And remember, by religion I mean this non-religion religion. That's how it's used in India now. It includes so an attitude of you can't have unqualified respect for an ambivalent entity such as religion, and nor can you have active disrespect for it. Can't just. You've got to have some critical respect, and this critical respect has to be embodied in a policy which I have called principal distance. Principal distance is very different from strict exclusion, strict separation, from the one-sided exclusion of France, from the mutual exclusion of the United States of America, from the one-sided support for one religion that exists in many parts of Europe. Europe has a very strong, I don't know how long that will be true, but it certainly has a very strong ethos of secular humanism. So religion salience has declined, Christianity salience has declined, and therefore religion has declined. But of course, a lot of people think of secular humanism also within the framework of religion. That's also, they also try and religionize it, which is sad and tragic. But in Europe, even though religion is sort of weakened, there are the institutions in Europe have this bias in favor of one church or one religion. We know, for example, in England, you have the Anglican Church, which is still established. There are 8 or 9 European countries with established churches. There are some reasons for that, very undesirable ethical reasons, which came into play in 16th, 17th century Europe. I talked about them. But you have a country like Denmark, which is 95% Lutheran, where if you die, you don't register with the state, but you register with the Lutheran Church. All the burial grounds are owned by the Lutheran Church, and you have to take permission from the Lutheran Church to bury your dead. There was a time when only burial grounds are available only to Lutherans, then of course it was extended to Catholics, then to Jews, finally to atheists, but Muslims find it still very difficult to bury their dead. And there is also a problem with the very practice of burial. In Denmark, it's a law that you have to put the body in a casket in order to bury it. And the Muslims don't do that. And that also is a problem. So I was shocked when I heard this. And in 2000, after Sweden disestablished this church, Lutheran church, there was an island off the coast of Copenhagen, which now that it was Swedish island, but now that Sweden was disestablished, Muslims could then bury their dead there, rather than bear all the expenses to send their dead bodies to their so-called original homelands, whether it was Tunisia or Algeria, which must have cost the earth. I mean, I don't. That's the context in which you have to place this whole cartoon controversy. All these things are there. So, okay, so we have the example of Europe. Now, Indian secularism, as I said, political secularism, as I said, must have, because of this ambivalence of religion, because it has this attitude that we have to respect religious experiences or broadly ethical experiences in whatever form, whatever practice, worship, ritual, this belief, but also the not, you have to check these forms of domination, which could have been treated as separate from these religions, but because of the way we group them together under the same category, they're also religion, and therefore it's right to call it religious domination. The strategy of dealing with this whole thing by the state has to be one of principal distance. And what do I mean by principal distance? I mean the following, that you engage with religion or you disengage from it. You engage positively with religion, which is to say help religion, subsidies to religious communities to maintain their educational institutions, because it's very important for them to bring their children, to instruct their children in their own religion, but also engage negatively with them. As we know, you have untouchability, you have to throw open the temples to everybody, you have to throw open public wells to everybody. There are all sorts of gender injustices in personal laws, and you have to intervene in them. So you adopt this flexible strategy. You can't say, like the Americans, that we will not do religion, we will neither help religion nor hinder it, that's their own game. You can't, unlike France, say we will only, we'll have an attitude of suspicion, because they don't understand the distinction between religious experience and religion. It's all within religion. And they're hostile to religion. I mean, not now, but initially. And so, can't have that, and you certainly can't have this European attitude of only being favorable to one religion, right? So you have to have a different strategy, different strategies rather, and these strategies will have to keep one goal in mind. That goal has to be primarily reduction of inter- and intra-religious domination. And of course, protection of religious experiences, because those are very vital. I mean, that's ethics of self-fulfillment. And the plurality of it, whether it's dependent on God, or gods and goddesses, or entirely independent of God, all of that must be protected. Okay, let me come to my final section. I promised that I would say some critical remarks about secularists and myself. So, now, Asa Berlin famously remarked at one time that the history of ideas is replete with great liberating ideas, slowly turning into suffocating straitjackets. All ideas, no matter what you do over a period of time, you forget the point of why they arose, you become lazy, there is lack of will, you are corrupted by various things, you pick up flaws, bad habits. It happened to the greatest cricketers, such as the Tendulkar also picks up bad habits when he plays, and secularists when they play a secularist game, they pick up so many bad habits. And I'll point to some of them. First of all, lazily defending secularism as a formula, not even remembering that it's not just an institutional strategy, but a normative entity which has certain goals. Getting what those goals are. Not remembering that, it's this complex, flexible, highly sophisticated conception that is enshrined in the Constitution that has to be defended, rather than some, lazily understood Western version, which one is read from textbooks, whether it is the French one or the American one. Just repeat all of separation, privatization of religion. None of it is the Indian, the model of, it's just not, it's nothing to do with India. And of course our governments, and I'm not even talking about that, how our governments have messed it up, I'm not talking about these governments, I'm talking about secularists. The governments have always interfered when they should not have interfered. They have not interfered when they should have interfered. They have respected those aspects which deserve no respect, and they have disrespected those aspects which should have been respected. So, they've turned the whole thing upside down. Every political party have actually named it party political secularism. That's very different from the theoretical secularism that I'm talking about, and certainly the constitutional secularism, which of course even the judges keep making a mess of. I hope that I'm not. Anyway. Now, so a few more points. One manifestation of this misunderstanding is the total identification of secularism, at least during a very long phase, with the defense of minority rights, as if the sole purpose of secularism is to oppose inter-religious domination. But this forgets that there is a very important purpose of secularism, which is to encourage freedom and equality centered reforms within every religious community, to protect individuals from oppression from their own members. Don't forget, Western secularism, if that is what we have to remember, Western secularism is all about only this. There is no religious diversity to deal with. There's only the oppression of the church. The politically meddlesome and socially oppressive nature of this church own their own church, and they have to save their individuals to emancipate them from this. Now, intra-religious domination is the primary goal, and we've forgotten that. The secularism that we practice doesn't keep that in mind, that we have to rescue Hindus, Muslims, Christians from their own religious extremists, from their own religious orthodoxies. That's a very important job of secularism. And to put all the burden of minorities to, and as if they are the ones who have to save secularism from is completely unfair. And if you do this, if you say, for example, that this is all there for Muslims, the Hindus have nothing to do with it, then it's very easy to slowly see secularism as pro-Muslim and then to take the next step that is anti-Hindu. Now, that's been a problem, and I think that we should have guarded against much more. I think that is now something that a lot of people are aware of, but I remember a very long phase when this happened, and probably some people still do it. The third rather, is that we should make a distinction between communitarian and communal. Communitarianism is not the same as communalism. A communitarian position is one that argues that an individual is partly defined by his or her religious commitments and traditions, which traditions, of course, are possession of the entire community, right? So that's why you can't be defined independently of the community. And if that is the case, then obviously there's nothing wrong in calling yourself either a Hindu or a Muslim. Sometimes you take legitimate pride in the fact that you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. And when people do some very nasty things, to be ashamed of being a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. That's part of it. That happens only if you have that community identification. Communalism, on the other hand, is different. It is a communal perspective is one in which one's community identity is defined necessarily in opposition, not in dialogue with, but in opposition to other communities, such that one's existence and interests are realized only at the expense of other communities. In other words, one can't be a Hindu without being an anti-Muslim, and vice versa. This conflation had actually beleaguered some secularists, I wouldn't say all, some secularists with a Hindu background. Many so-called, we don't use the term Hindu secularists, but many Hindu secularists have found it very difficult to articulate Hindu interests or views without sounding communal. And they've defended Muslim interests as if what they were doing was communal, but okay, by the mere fact that these are vulnerable minorities. So it's kind of a paternalistic attitude. No, this is fine for them, but we shouldn't be. But that's not going to work, I'm afraid. And finally, something about education. Our education, and I'm not talking about specialists, I'm talking about our education as Indian citizens. Remember, I'm talking about we as the whole of Indian citizens. I think our ignorance about, as citizens, our ignorance about religious philosophical traditions is astounding. Most students come out of the university without any understanding of their own religious philosophical tradition, or of those traditions in which they weren't born. I mean, our understanding of Islamic traditions, for example, is just horrible. We just don't understand anything about that. And likewise for perhaps Muslims or Hindus, I don't know, but certainly many Hindus of their own traditions. I think our school education system doesn't really allow for that. And that means that our critique and defense of religion is shallow at best, and it can very easily become mischievous. So I think the defense of minority rights must be accompanied by a robust critique of minority and majority extremism and communalism. I know that Nehru did say that majority communalism is worse than minority communalism, but they feed on each other. There is no way that you can not denounce minority extremism in the same breath. Well, not literally in the same breath, but some, you know. So, and all of this must be accompanied by a deeper understanding and defense of the best in each religious philosophical position. So, we need to work much harder to ensure that we don't lose this very important perspective, because really we can't afford not to be secular. It's going to tear our social fabric apart, is detrimental to our very rich heritage, and is crucial for fighting all kinds of domination. So if you want to build a good, a free and equal society, we can't afford not to be secular.
And friends, we have some 10 minutes or so for brief comments or questions. It has been a very serious lecture, so the questions can be a little more witty or humorous or something. Go ahead. The first one, the first one who is a bit hesitant, and after the first one has raised his hand, the others follow. So is there a courageous person? Oh yeah, there you are. Please go ahead.
Great to be the first one, because the Gyani log are not speaking, so maybe a Gyani can ask a question. So, there are many things in religions, as you said, there are common, the rain gods and all kinds of things. You know, like this one common thread that I see is of violence. You know, all the religions, all the signs and symbols and parables and stories and everything, they are replete with violence. I mean, the symbols themselves are violent. They are either, you know, talwar, tir, talwar, khanda, you know, or the stories are full of violence, you know. And we also see that there is an inherent message in that look, the societies will be peaceful, and I take violence in my own hands. And we also see even Tirthankars, you know, in Jainism, which is like so peaceful in every sense and non-violent. You know, they also slay demons, you know. So, yeah, there are, I can give you examples. So, I mean, there is a violent thread, you know, thread of violence. And now we see that that gets embedded with statehood. And with state, there is, you know, religion, violence, state together make a great combination. And today, when we see that all of this is coming to the aid of nationalism, and then majoritarianism, and then perhaps to the rescue of the nation state, sovereign nation state, which is under threat or attack from some kind of globalization. And the rivals, the secularists, the Democrats, the liberals, they are on a retreat. You know, so, I mean, what is going on? You think?
I should have, yeah. So, you know, you're really talking about what are now classified as world religions. I was talking largely about popular religious traditions, which have probably even they have been violent, because the sensibly violence is inescapable. But I was talking more about popular religious traditions. But even these so-called world religions, I mean, we've got to remember, and there are two things that most of these great sort of texts, they themselves are very ambivalent. There are two things which are very clearly inscribed in them. One is that that violence is central to them. but not all. I mean, as a matter of fact, the one religion, which was 3 religions, I mean, later you can, the non-violence was actually at the core of it, and doctrinally, Buddhism, Jainism, and of course, early Christianity. It was all about love. So, while, no, it'll be hard to find texts of the original texts where, this kind of violence is eulogized in any of these. But even if that were the case, I would simply say that many of these world religions were born at a certain time which was characterized, no matter how great they are, which are characterized by three things. One, no democracy, right? Number 2, the status of women was horrendous. And number 3, material prosperity, a basic modicum of material prosperity. The availability of basic material well-being was never seen to be an aspiration for everybody. Even those religions that talked about equality didn't talk about equality. They talked about equality in the face of God, but they didn't have. And so these are very new developments, and I would say, let me just concede the point that there is violence in these world religions.
I'm not so sure about the violence part, but I'm sure most religions recognize evil. I think that's central to most religion, and you can transfer from one religion to another and say, well, we see this as evil, and that religion sees that as evil, and therefore the consequence of it is take up arms against that evil, and that could be the other religion. My name is Bohida, and I work on an initiative I call socio-cultural symbiogenesis. That when you put 2, either inter or intra-religious forces together, you get a third, which is exactly what Ayappa is. You put Shaivism and Vaishnavism together, and you get Mohini, and then you'll get a child who's the child of both. Weird concepts. But let me take this away from spirituality and conceptualities and ask you a commercial question. How much is a minority, or how much is a religious community worth to a nation as a consumer? In the sense that, is there any data which says this particular religion spends X amount of money in its religious practices, and therefore it is worth affording that minority in your country? I bring in the word because of the word afford. I didn't see afford as a word for, as an afford. But in terms of money-wise, then yes, we ought to have more of these religious, today's Thanksgiving, and many turkeys are going to go, the way that God willed it. In that sense, is there any at all? And of course, this is associated with the fact that, can you afford an education in JNU? So, I'm trying to wonder if there are such data available.
A very interesting question, but I'm afraid I have no answer to that.
Will you try and work this out? I'll give you my number, and maybe we'll work this together. Yeah? I've done one for the Christians once.
I'll tell you what, there is a woman scholar who's worked on the economy of religion. She's just published that book. I think I would recommend that you contact her. I think she would be a very good introduction.
I'd actually done it at a lecture in an MBA school where we talked about what happens during this period between now and January, and how the Christians spend. I'm sure Islam spends in a particular way, Hindu, and I don't think it's in terms of total volume spent, but per capita, I think it's worth affording secularism.
I see that. I see your point.
May I?
For me, I mean, whenever I think about the word secular or democracy, or democrat as opposed to the secular or whatever, they seem the same to me. For example, the question of Sabarimal or Ram Mandir or whichever, Ayodhya, ultimately, is it a good decision from the point of view of secularism or from democracy? For me, I can't see the difference between the two. So what do you think? I mean, when you say, can we afford not to be secular? Or if I were to say, can we afford not to be democratic? Is that the same thing roughly? Because I can't see the distinction, frankly.
I think the way we've understood secular, what it does is to focus on some aspects of our society where religion comes in a big way. There are many aspects of our society where religion doesn't enter. So democracy is something which is a much wider, it's got a much wider scope. There are lots of things where you need to make decision making along democratic lines. Religion is one of them. So I think the reason why we need something like the word secular is just to sharpen our focus on those matters which have predominantly, which are infused predominantly by some religious concern. Now, this is difficult for those religions which, I mean, those societies where religion permeates every other aspect, you know. So, I mean, Ambedkar made this point, that where do we make a distinction between what is religious and what is social? So, in a sense, you may be right about places such as India, that here it's very, very difficult to distinguish an issue which is a concern for democracy and an issue that is a concern for secularism. But still, I would say theoretically, analytically, it's very important to make that distinction. You must, these are two different things. And of course, purely analytically and theoretically, we know that there are a lot of secular states which are not democratic.
Yes.
There are authoritarian secularisms. I mean, Turkey is a very good example where there was, I mean, don't forget that there are societies which, like China, which are ostensibly secular, but they are not democratic. So it's not as if this is something which is, conceptually it would be very wise to just put the two together, because it's not as if the two have always been conceptually intertwined. They're not.
Rajiv, I think it was a brilliant exposition of a very difficult subject. But I wanted you to dwell on another kind of perspective on this, which is, especially when you spoke about, you brought in what Nehru said, and so therefore there is also a state perspective to secularism. The question is that it all goes back to the nature of man. So if the nature of man is acquisitive of power, then irrespective of whether it's kind of mono-religious kind of societies then have fractions in religion itself. So if you would see, there would be somebody who would be a Barelvi, and then there would be somebody who's a Devbandi, and they will interpret it differently for ascendancy in that society itself. So the question here is that
if the nature is such, of human beings is such, that they're acquisitive of power, then religion, it is not inter-religion or intra-religion only in that sense, because you can then, as you said, can we afford not to be secular? The question here is that if you look at it from the state's perspective, then it is a problem if you were not to calibrate the policy in such a manner that you prevent that push from a very powerful, overwhelming religious ideology, if I may use that term, to push aside the others till such time that the others are decimated. Now the question answer, the one case in example is Pakistan. So they more or less did away with their Hindu population. So very few are left, or Christians for that matter. So they did away with that. And then they started fighting with themselves, among themselves. And yet there is a huge amount of continuous interpretation of what an Islamic state should be. And therefore there would always be a pushback for some groups which are being thrown out. And so I think there is this whole question of the nature of man, which is at the heart of how we behave. And more or less wherever you have what we call liberal, secular, liberal democratic countries, because even you gave a lot of examples, but Iran is a classic example of a democracy which is Islamic in nature. Because they have elections, their presidents can't be for more than 2 terms and so on, all that kind of thing, but it's still a very Islamic country. So it is the question of nature of man, and if that is so, then how do you place yourself in this situation where there's an overwhelming, like we were saying, the communalism of majority is worse than that of minority, was said in this perspective. How do you then react to that?
I don't believe that there is a fixed nature of man. I mean, there is a lot of plasticity in human nature. We know that what human beings are changes from place to place and from time. And if human beings learn from their experience in the past, then they also grow. And we devise many institutions to check what we recognize to be the worst in us, right? I mean, it's not as if we're not prone to do certain things which you would consider to be, wrong, but there are a number of direct and indirect strategies, a number of institutions we develop, right? Democracy, you can say, is one such invention which ensures that people do not perpetually exercise power over others, that there is some kind of power sharing, that there is collective decision making. There are so many other institutions like that we've devised. So I would say that to your specific question, you're absolutely right that the core beliefs and practices of any religion are bound to be interpreted variously, and therefore there will be multiple interpretations. Now, very often these people who form sects, they themselves become rival groups, and then they fight with each other, right? Now, we can either allow the development, we can allow certain institutions to encourage violence between them, exploit that, manipulate it, to serve our own political ends, or we can encourage a dialogue between them to, at least have a policy of live and let live, if not other very profound strategies that people have been inventing for a long time. I mean, I'm very fond of the Emperor Ashoka's inscriptions, where Ashoka, as a ruler, put forward the view that these different pashandas, they must come face to face, encounter one another, exercise self-restraint, particularly restraint in speech. And the whole purpose of that was, as far as he was concerned, that every pashanda is incomplete in some ways. That it's only through mutual encounter that they can enrich each other, that they can grow, because there is no pashanda which is, you can call it sect, or you can call it, people with different religious philosophical groups. None of them have, all of them are striving, all of them are trying to get to something, and nobody has achieved it. And there is no way to achieve it unless there is a common foundation where the dialogue and discussion of some kind can take place. Now, this is something that he mentioned in the 3rd century BC, in the first ever written record that we have in India. And I think it has had a very big impact on Indian culture, even though that has never been explicitly mentioned. I think our social machinery has been shaped in certain ways by that. So that after all the ensuing conflict and battles and so on, we come back to something like that, and that is my hope, that we will eventually come around to that. So we develop practices and institutions to check precisely what is worst in us. Sometimes we do exactly the opposite. We encourage the worst in us by those very institutions. But I would say that I wouldn't, just the fact that there are different interpretations doesn't mean that there would be, exclusion, violence. Pakistan, for example, didn't start like that. That's a controversial. But still, there are. It really became very bad after Bhutto's and Zia's accession and American interference, where I don't know if many of you know this, that the curriculum of the madrasas were written in the University of Nebraska. Wow. And the whole strategy of Talibanization was something which was manufactured to fight the Soviets. Now, this can be, don't read it as a conspiracy theory. But I'm talking about, what I'm saying is that there are lots of factors which are responsible for the creation of a kind of a monstrous, Islamicist state in Pakistan. It has had problems from the very beginning, I think. But it's just got very bad later. So yeah, I think.
One last question.
Yeah. So, no, but I was waiting. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I was curious how you would mention about the we in the title of your lecture, and you didn't really pause on it. You just said that this we is like we Indians. So I was just wondering throughout your lecture that I kept thinking on the we, and and also because I felt that there is a certain assumption behind placing the we, and also somewhere the whole problem of the secular, particularly today in today's context, is pretty much hanging around the question of the we, and so on one side, we can no longer perhaps, or the older claim of, or an idea of the we that we had very easily is sort of under stress, under question. There's a different idea of we, which is right now being imposed, over the whole country, which again goes into the whole question around secularism, which many have said that it is impossible to kind of talk about secularism, let's say in India or in any other country, without linking it with the nation or nationalism. And also that is true for us right now, because this whole idea of the we and who we are is and the battle that is right now going on is will actually have a huge impact on what the meaning of secularism will emerge in the coming times. And I'm not only merely putting it negatively, because the question of the we was also a very, very a sort of secular humanist we, which had also excluded a lot of others in that whole idea, in very many ways in which the West had also excluded many others. So yeah, so I was thinking that perhaps this premise of the we is also.
I'm we the people. It's that we. And that's why I said all of Indian citizens. I'm presuming that there is. I'm presuming a certain community. It's not an ethno-national community. It's a community which is composed of different religious philosophical groups. In the context that, at least in the way that since I was talking about secular. So you're right. I didn't give enough thought on it, but I would say that I did think of it. It's not as if I ignored it completely, and I was wondering, what this we is. But we use these terms quite a lot. We talk about the good society. Are we talking about each and every member of the society? Are we talking about a certain qualities that that society should have? And when we talk about a tolerant society, we don't mean that every single person is tolerant in that society. But we do assume that there are enough people in that society who are tolerant, and they will check whatever forces of intolerance that they would arise from time to time. We can't live in an illusory world thinking that we will not have all these other people who are either violent or who are extremely dogmatic or who are exclusionary. But if you call a society, if you qualify it, if you say that the society is of a certain kind, you're assuming that there are enough people working to sustain a society with those qualities. The good thing about groups, all groups, is that everybody doesn't have to be working for the group all the time. That's the nature of groups, that a group can sustain itself by some people working, enough people working for it at different times. So if you want to build a secular society, you don't have to have every person who is a secular and who is working for secularism all the time. You just have to have enough people working. Not even at the same time, but at different times. I just assume that there's a contest over who the we is. And that's been there for 150 years now in India, at least. The we is a religious community defined to the exclusion of others, or the we is all of us. And the we, you rightly pointed out, is always in the imagination of those who are imagining it, have not included everybody. But in principle, if through struggles they can all be included, then we can flesh out the we in the way in which we have, in which I've tried to envision. So I don't know if it's an adequate answer to the question, but that's what I answer.
Friends, it was a brilliant lecture, and of course it evoked a lot of discussion. I'm not asking you questions because I should not. The three things. I keep on wondering if religions have embodied spiritual truths. All spiritual truths have been discovered 2,000 odd number of years ago, and we are spiritually some kind of a posthumous people who have no right to add to the spiritual truths discovered by the religions 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. One. Two, some of the values which we talk about and take for granted, that they are the values which are the most acceptable democratic values and which are propounded by our constitution, namely values of freedom, equality, and justice. They are essentially spiritual. They became political and social much later, but they all emanated in theology. And the third point is, how is it that there have been no reformist movement among religions in the last 70 years? Pre-independence area was marked by reformist movements among Hindus, among Muslims, about many other religions. I see no reformist movement taking place. And the fourth, I think, is religions in this country are falling behind democracy. In the sense they are not able to cope with democracy in some creative, meaningful way. So the only way they can cope with it is to kind of dominate it, to make it into a kind of a dictatorship, which at least one of the major religions already seem to be succeeding. But that's how it. But that's not true. These are just thoughts which came to my mind. Thank you very much for coming. It was a thank RAJEEV, Bhargava, and thank you all of you. You have been here for 2 hours, which is more than what one can expect from Delhi citizens these days, given the levels of pollution and the snarls of traffic jams. I think there was one gentleman who was left out because we run out of time. So sorry. Thank you very much.